Okay, so a couple of things. Welcome. A couple of things based on what Annie just said. I was presenting at the Goldsmiths Archives Matter conference on the work of Prince because he had just passed. And when you said that almost 10 years ago, I cannot believe that he left this earth, and things have not been the same ever since. In 2016, he really left us, a mess to hold. But I say that with all seriousness because my heart is sore. My heart is sore as we speak because we just lost an incredible artist by the name of D'Angelo. And raise your hand if you're familiar with D'Angelo. Raise your hand if you are familiar with his actual music and you spent at least 10 minutes with his music. Okay. It's a massive sort of Black diasporic global heartbreak for so many reasons. He was 51 years old and part of a real painful trend of artists and Black folks in general dying prematurely, right? And if you spend a little time looking through the sort of biographical details of his life and of the life of Prince and of the life of Michael Jackson and of the life of Whitney Houston, right? Even the life of folks like DMX, you'll notice a pattern around sort of just like the complicated music industrial complex and the history, the long-standing history of, the exploitation of Black artists. And so I just wanted to start by calling D'Angelo's name, and just honoring what he's left behind, and his discography is something that many of us will be holding on to very closely for years to come. My name is Lynnée Denise, DJ Lynnée Denise. Also, I want to say if there was ever an opportunity for me to DJ on a college campus as an undergraduate and even a graduate student in the 90s, my life would be different right now. That's incredible as a way to kind of develop that skill and that practice. So shout out to the DJs who are spinning today. That's you, I see you. It's major, it's a great skill set. And then tomorrow's workshop will explore my sort of trajectory and also history with DJing and close listening as a method. Yes, welcome to the talk. I am from Los Angeles, California. I always like to start by sharing the fact that I was born in 1975 and that I am 50 years old. It gives a little context because I want you all, especially those of you who are interested in DJing, but also just, sound art and just, various sonic practices in general, is like the time that you are born oftentimes reflects your approach or can reflect your approach, including the massive access that you all have to millions of songs that I never had access to while I was kind of developing my ear as a DJ, which meant that my listening practice comes out of a very slow, full album kind of practice, right? That I sat down with many albums and listened to albums in their entirety, for years. And then as things begin to progress, and technology began to advance, I will say I had a bit of a heartbreak because my relationship to DJing and to listening changed. I found myself being less patient, also spending less time with the music, therefore developing a less intimate kind of connection with the music, whereas I grew up in a situation where, I grew up on hip hop, grew up on rap, and I listened to the music so much that I knew every word, I memorized everything. So even my memory and the role of memorization in the practice of DJing is interesting and then becomes kind of complicated as technology, progresses, and we then have access to so much music that, quite frankly, damn near depresses me because I am unable to focus. So I say that because it requires focus. Being in a PhD program and focusing on listening requires that I sit still again at the age of 50. But also age matters because the kind of social political context of my interest in DJ culture, being born and raised in Los Angeles, California, while Ronald Reagan was president And while Thatcher, right, was prime minister, played a role in how I witnessed the 80s. It played a role in how I understand the HIV/AIDS crisis, how I understand the war on drugs and the criminalization of addiction. It plays a role in the emergence of technology, or rather electronic music, and the technology that made it possible, and this kind of proliferation of subgenres that happened in Black communities during a time when their communities were under siege. And so all of those things have shaped my research questions. So that age, and that time frame matters, because being born in 1975 does mean that I grew up witnessing, hearing and remembering the first AIDS case. And then kind of listening to how the music began to change, how Prince, for example, referenced AIDS by saying, by chance a fat man died with a big disease with a little name, right? That's clever. But also, he was among very few artists to be like the first to address it through song, especially considering the fact that the Reagan administration refused to address it for years, and by the time they did, thousands of people, were disappeared, and many of those folks were among the most vulnerable, and they were not just white gay men, but also Black queer folks across the board, heroin users, folks who were getting blood transfusions, women, straight women, cis women. So my work comes out of that context of that complicated but super productive in terms of electronic music and that sound. So welcome to the talk. That's my introduction. And it all came through the kind of emotion that emerged from the mere mentioning of Prince and then D'Angelo. But sound system geographies and dropping the needle on a city. So first, I'll talk to you all a little bit about my research. And also, this is an interesting kind of experiment, because I am sharing with you the sort of like sketching of my chapter on Johannesburg. These are essentially my notes, and how I plan to approach the topic of HIV/AIDS in South Africa, and very specifically in Johannesburg. Although, when you're dealing with South African music, obviously people move, subgenres develop based on region and city and time and towns. So, it includes Pretoria, Durban, and Cape Town, but Johannesburg is the primary focus for my chapter. So, well, actually, let me start with DJ scholarship, because there's a story there, and I shared with you something very important, right? Which essentially was, no, not Zotia. My computer wants me to work. Hold on, wait. Oh no. Okay, so let me back up and talk about DJ scholarship before I introduce you to how it's evolved. In 2013, I was living in Detroit, and it was very cold. And also, I had become frustrated by where DJ culture was sort of heading. As I said, this onslaught of like hyper accessible music. And I was trying to think about the culture and its meaning, and I was grant writing at the time. So I took a chance, and I was like, I'm gonna come up with this concept that I hope will be funded, but I'm gonna try to convince folks to invest in this idea around the importance of the DJ as a cultural worker. And so I needed, money. So there was desperation and urgency, which created a really interesting kind of innovative approach to DJ culture as an art form. And so with that came this idea of 4 cultural practices. So with this quote by Elizabeth White, because it ties into the work, if you listen deep enough, everything has a sound. If you learn to hear it, you'll be surrounded by memory. If you learn to name what you hear, you'll be surrounded by relatives, right? And just having me think through my own work, being surrounded by memories, and being able to name what I hear, and not just present what I hear for the purpose of entertainment value, but to really get into the understanding, right? To listen deep enough to understand how to listen. And so I came up with these 4 cultural practices, sampling being the first. Also growing up in Los Angeles, which made it super, easy for me to kind of grow up listening to Dr. Dre's spin on the radio, right? But what I would do is kind of record these radio shows and then memorize my favorite songs. And then my dad or my mom or my older sister would come into the room and be like, oh, that's James Brown. Or how are these rappers rapping over James Brown? I'm like, I'm sorry, you're sadly mistaken. That's Public Enemy, right? And they're like, no, this is my dad. Will be like, no, that's Funky Drummer. And I'm like, well, how is that possible? Are you saying that my favorite rapper is biting, right? Which in the 1980s, you don't bite. You know what biting means? Stealing, taking ideas, right? So in the 80s growing up, we'd be like, don't bite me. Like, don't, which is interesting because like folks don't want to be bitten in academia. They want to be cited, right? So it's in thank you. Hey, this thing is on. So yes, is exactly that. Like if you're gonna bite me, cite me. Cite me as the origin, right? Source for this sound. And so that's complicated in itself because sampling was a new art form, right? And folks weren't citing like the James Browns, the Aretha Franklins, they weren't citing people. And so and this is why I had no idea that they were like sampling these songs and kind of using hip hop as a repository and kind of, depositing like these, sounds from different places, decades, genres, right? And teaching me how to listen again, but not necessarily giving me the tools to understand, the sound of place or the sound of jazz or whatever it was. Interestingly enough, Biz Markie, which is a rapper from the 1980s, was one of the first to kind of be held accountable by the music industry, who noted the fact that a number of, I'm thinking of a specific label, that one of their artists was being sampled and not cited, right? That there wasn't a credit. And so there was a full-on sort of legal dispute about it, and also Biz Markie lost. And from that moment forward, it became like legally required to cite those sources, to cite who you were sampling, which then changed the way I could hear hip hop, but then also sort of expanded my understanding of soul and funk and jazz, and also what it means to DJ and to produce, because I had to consider, hey, how did Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest, use that sample? What drove him there? And part of what drove him there, and let me get into this idea of repetition, sampling and repetition, I'm feeling like are things that I want to think through together. That idea of like, if something is there for you, in Black culture, the thing, the ritual, the dance, the beat is there for you to pick it up. When you come back to I'm sorry, let me read it from here. Again, I said I'm 50, my eyesight is good. In Black culture, the thing, the ritual, the dance, the beat is there for you to pick it up. When you come back to get it, is a real powerful way to say that, in this context, he is kind of talking to and through Black folks, that it is our responsibility to listen to what has come before. And then for hip hop to then repurpose what they hear and present it in a different context ends up being something that is a part of the culture, and even diasporically, but I guess even culture in general, and how ideas, dances, movements, get passed on. So that's on repetition. But part of why I was intrigued by what, Q-Tip was doing is because he was digging through the crates. He was really listening closely to all forms of music, to many forms of music, and collecting and listening deeply enough to say, I want to use the first 20 seconds of that song, or I want to use that break and then bring back another song to sample and then create a new song, right, out of two songs to create essentially three songs. And so listening to patterns, listening to know, listening to teach, listening to transmit, listening for distinction, listening for future references, listening to blend, listening to connections, listening to critique, listening to decode, and then listening as pleasure-informed labor. And so that's the second cultural practice. The third, album cover analysis and thinking about Black music visual culture and the history of album covers. Also the political history of album covers, because they are not, it is not a neutral conversation. When we're talking about representation, visual representation of essentially corporate distributed music, right? So say, for example, Miles Davis had to fight Columbia to prevent them from placing white women on his cover, right? On his album cover, James Brown too. So one of the things that happened with Miles Davis is that he won one of those battles, and he was able to put his wife on the cover of an album called ESP, and that wife was Cicely Tyson, who's a very famous actress who also passed. But just the kind of political nature of album covers was very interesting to me for several reasons. A, because it also presented evidence of existence. So you have My Boy Lollipop by Millie, who's a Black British artist who came here from Jamaica in the 1940s as a part of the Windrush migration. And this is the very first sort of like reggae hit on the UK charts. And we know that, like, you know, the discussion around reggae and sound systems are super hyper masculine and just sort of like this kind of cishet patriarchal approach to sound, oftentimes where women and queer folks are marginalized. And so album covers then become just like a way for us to remember. Then you have Sister Rosetta Thorpe. Interesting, I wasn't even trying to make all of these British connections, but she becomes famous because she comes here and performs this song, Gospel Train, in London. And from there, you know, inspires Mick Jagger and all these folks that, you know, the Led Zeppelins that are here, the Pink Floyds, and this kind of classic rock crew that was like, wait a minute, there's this Black woman who's coming out of the church from the South who is teaching us new things with this guitar. So it's also rare and interesting and important to see Black women, but, you know, women in general, with instruments in their hands as a part of the album cover. One thing that I've noticed in my research is like the kind of willingness to remove instruments from women who play them when they're photographed or even on their album covers. So this is another example. And then Beverly Glenn Copeland is a trans artist who has been and was super active as a kind of folk electronic musician throughout the 70s and the 80s. And so just evidence of, you know, of that existence, of their presence. Also regional, regional rhythms and genres and themes. This is Cybertron, which is one of the first techno groups coming out of Detroit, right? Detroit techno. And then themes connected to this kind of future-oriented engagement of the 1980s in Detroit, and how during that time Reagan's policies made it such that, you know, social programs were dismantled, folks were defunded, and forced to kind of turn to things like secondhand equipment, electronic equipment, drum machines, beat machines, synthesizers to play with after they had been discarded. And then out of that comes, right, techno music. And so even this kind of play with otherworldliness at a time when people were literally leaving Detroit, the city, in droves, considering the kind of collapse of the automobile industry. And so what does it mean for Black folks to be looking at the future through techno, right? And how does that show up on album covers? And then also ideology and cosmology. Raise your hand if you're familiar with Parliament Funkadelic. Raise your hand if you spent more than 5 minutes with their music. Okay, that just helps me know who's in the room. Because also, if you were listening to, you know, Parliament Funkadelic, then actually you were listening to a kind of echo, or maybe a source to the sound of Prince and D'Angelo, right? Because they are in the same kind of lineage. But anyway, Parliament Funkadelic were super, super like inspiring, not just because of all of the drugs they used, but that was absolutely part of it. I'm not sure I would love them if they weren't engaged in drugs. This is not by any means me promoting drugs. This is about the historical role of drugs in Black music. I'm thinking of Jimi Hendrix. I'm thinking of the bebop era. I'm thinking of Charlie Parker, sadly, because the thing is, it always kind of ends in tragedy. So I am not celebrating, but I am saying I am curious about what the sound of groups like Parliament would be without the use of drugs. It's interesting. But this kind of ideology and this cosmology around like otherworldliness, just like other realms and kind of transcending this place we call Earth, thinking through race by creating an escape plan, creating these like fictional characters that are fully developed with ideas. They worked with an artist by the name of Pedro Bell, who would listen closely to the sound and the lyrics and then produce the kind of visual response to that sound and to those lyrics. And so, if you listen to like all of Parliament's albums and take notes, you'll have a whole ass like graphic novel, like that you could create based on their ideas. Songs like Aqua Boogie, Mothership Connection, right? Maggot Brain, America Eats Its Young, right? To kind of think through capitalism. And so that is why album covers matter to me. And then also liner notes. In my practice, I think about, reading liner notes as a genre of literature alongside contemporary and historical academic texts. So listening to text and identifying the narrative thread, connecting the Black Atlantic network of sound, but then also, you all could read this for yourselves, but in my work, I argue that these ways of knowing offer a complex form of personhood that resists dominant narratives focused solely on loss. I examine how narratives of the Black gay Renaissance often privilege literary and visual Black expressive cultures, frequently at the expense of queer sound-making practices. In my spare time, I write books. No, but the thing is, I actually did write this book during the pandemic, and I wrote it while I was in my first year of my PhD in 2020. And this book is a combination of my kind of approach to DJ scholarship, because you may know Willie Mae Thornton, sadly, because of how she hasn't been recognized. She is the person who originally sang the song Hound Dog, which Elvis Presley not only made famous, but is getting paid for it right now. Right now, right? That his estate owns the rights to the song, and that and that when I think about like his actual, his body is buried in the house where he lived, or near the house where he lived in Graceland, and it is one of the most visited sort of cemeteries or places of where folks go to visit the dead in the U.S. It is the most visited space to kind of see and pay respect to an artist who is no longer here. Elvis Presley is still making money from the song Hound Dog. Willie Mae Thornton died broke, addicted to alcohol, and kind of, again, mirroring these stories that kind of resemble what happened to folks like D'Angelo. But I also had to do things like not necessarily chase samples, but I had to read the liner notes of other artists like Howlin' Wolf or, B.B. King, to find out more about Willie Mae Thornton. Her name would sort of just be dropped, right? We were in Texas in 1972 and we saw Big Mama perform here, right? And I would have to chase that sample and then go dig through the crates of whatever it was, the kind of Monterey Pop Festival, to see if she was there and to read the program. Oh, she was there. She performed 5 songs. Here are the songs, right? Because there was only one biography written about her, and it was written by a man who lives in Germany, and I actually went to his house. His name is Michael Skorp, and interviewed him to also as a part of my kind of chasing the samples and digging through the crates process, because so many of the people who worked with her were no longer alive. And then, of course, the question of her album covers were really interesting because she was a woman who was considered to be obese and certainly not marketable. So they attempted to hide her body. So her album covers very much so focus on, themes that you can find in the music. And then the liner notes. There were very few liner notes written about Willie Mae, and the ones that were oftentimes written by white men. So writing this book was a bit of an intervention, but it's also sort of, it's proof that DJ scholarship as a method works, right? I just simply approached, my research and my listening practice and my reading practice to the journey of writing this book, and I produced a book. Thanks for the small finger snap. I know I hear you there. So that's this kind of history of that. This is who I came to, Goldsmiths as. This is what I am doing. I am theorizing my own body of work. It is a practice-based PhD. I am very much so a student of Black British cultural studies, the Hazel Carbys, the Paul Gilroy, of course, but then also the Stuart Halls. And so those things have made it really interesting and possible for me to think through sound and think through my body of work and even think through my album collection, understanding maybe like literary criticism is a way to, critique capitalism and the ways in which racialized capitalism affects Black musical artists, and certainly queer ones. So my current project for the PhD is turntable epistemology, and that is because I am interested in having us think about turntablism and DJ culture as a site of knowledge production. So one of the projects within that is, sound system geographies. So first I'll do just like an overview of turntable epistemology so that you all can understand where we're going next through sound system geographies. Turntable epistemology explores the under-theorized Black queer DJ culture and studio board musicianship produced during the early stages of the HIV/AIDS crisis. It conducts an auditory investigation of the long 80s as a sonic conjuncture. The project examines how, amidst social upheavals and homophobic hegemonic discourse about the HIV/AIDS virus, artists and musicians produced a range of subgenres of electronic music, constituting an archive of what I call a Black queer sound. Turntable epistemology draws on DJ scholarship to activate the archive to function as a record of a system of knowledge and material evidence of those who, through the government morally driven mismanagement of the crisis, were disappeared from dance floors, DJ booths, record labels, and studios. It calls attention to how DJs and producers characterize this sound with mixer-based live and pre-recorded edits, versions, extensions, blending, and dubbed vocals, techniques comparable to the Jamaican genre known as dub. The project uses case studies and a close listening approach to probe turntable-based music developments in Black queer spaces in New York, Chicago, London, and Johannesburg that happen in tandem with the emergence of neoliberalism and its policies that advanced a narrative of blame and neglect in the face of a raging pandemic. The project looks at how each city gave rise to queer cultural institutions of sounding that developed alongside a combination of social cultural circumstances that include the migration of the reggae sound system, underground township music, dance floor aesthetics, moral panic, and a fatal disease bound up with the politics of pleasure. Through reading liner notes, analyzing party flyers, and listening to queer-oriented discographies and Black queer DJ selections produced during the Black gay renaissance of the 1980s, this work sketches the contours of Black sonic queer time that centers on the sound of aliveness and dying as a mode of orientation. So, you guys with me? Cool. So sound system geographies, I am also very much so a student of Catherine McKittrick and how she kind of grapples with this idea, this notion of a Black sense of place. And this is a way of understanding kind of what I call a sonic conjuncture. So, yeah, sound system geographies. This was just the kind of description of the talk, but I wanted to say it myself so that you all can hear me say that sound system geographies is an experimental research methodology that listens for the peculiar and layered histories moving between countries, continents, and cities. Rooted in both practice and theory, sound system geographies attends to how sonic archives operate as aesthetic practices and as maps of memory. So on the question of music and place, and to introduce where I'm dropping the needle, I'm thinking about South Africa. Turntable epistemology adapts Catherine McKittrick's conceptual framework of a Black sense of place. In my research, this idea shifts the focus away from geographic processes shaped by plantation slavery, colonial rule, and the technologies of apartheid violence, and instead, as McKittrick writes, quote, towards reorienting and honoring where we know from. For my work, especially in the studying especially in studying the knowledge production found in South African contemporary music. A Black sense of place opens up ways to listen to how sound carries memories, geography, and survival. Black creative production emerges under the weight of violence, but it cannot be held there. It always finds ways to break through and reimagine possibility. It's through this lens that I think about how music becomes a site of Black innovation and knowledge production. So, depending on where one drops the metaphoric needle on Black life, you might find music that tells stories of survival, resistance, and imagination. The body of music I look at and listen to across various geographical sites represents musicians, producers, and listeners who sought refuge through music and through stolen gatherings, spaces of care and creation amid hostile, gendered ideologies like the welfare queen, the racialized criminalization of addiction like the war on drugs, and the fatal negligence surrounding sexuality, AIDS as a gay plague or a gay cancer, that shaped the ideologies of the Reagan, Thatcher, and apartheid regimes. In other words, dropping the needle on a city like Johannesburg, London, or Kingston opens up a world of questions about British colonialism, the Soweto uprisings, the migration of albums and cassettes, secondhand drum machines, and the material conditions that determine the quality of life and quality of care for Black people throughout the diaspora. The needle makes it possible to hear the sonic conjuncture. Because my work is rooted in listening as method, I've been drawn to conjunctural analysis, or conjuncture analysis as a way to think about how sound captures a moment in history. So, again, Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall contends that a conjuncture is a historically specific arrangement of forces, economic conditions, political institutions, cultural norms, and class relations that crystallizes into a relatively stable formation. My work draws on this framework to think through music and the sonic. A sonic conjuncture explores the sounds and musical practices that emerge in response to those historical forces. It asks how musicians, producers, and listeners register, resist, and reimagine the conditions of their time through sound. As it relates to South Africa, between 1913 and 1934, a number of strategies were put in place to prepare the ground for the 1948 institutionalization of apartheid. The 1913 Land Act prevented Black South Africans from buying land and forced them into specific areas of the country, setting up an early map of exclusion. During this period, the National Party was organizing the political and ideological framework that would later shape apartheid as a socially engineered city, one designed to control where and how Black people could live, work, and make sound. When I dropped this needle on South Africa, I'm listening for those shifts, the ways land, labor, and listening were organized, how separation was rehearsed and eventually set to law, and how even then, sound carries traces of refusal and becoming. So one of the first things I hear when I drop the needle on Johannesburg is Sophiatown, a township often referred to as Little Harlem because it was the center of South African jazz, dance, fashion, and literature. The literary arm of this township and this Renaissance era was Drum Magazine, which was founded in 1951. There were Sophiatown is very, very interesting because it was like the fertile grounds for where artists like Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba emerged. Sophiatown was also one of the first townships that existed before the formal institutionalization of apartheid in 1948. But by 1955, it was violently cleared. People were uprooted, displaced, and relocated. And by 1966, it was fully destroyed. So these are images of Drum Magazine. And I think what's really interesting about Sophiatown and why I find myself so drawn to it is because it was this idea of it being Little Harlem is really important in the context of diasporic dialogue, because so much of how they presented and created sound and moved their bodies were informed by what was happening in Black America. And that might sound, first of all, that's pretty common when you think about the role that in almost sometimes the uncomfortable, hyper visible and hyper presence of Black American culture to the sometimes, or at the expense of other folks in the diaspora. But this is just super interesting because the regime felt it necessary to try to silence that, or those kind of influences, or to prevent them from happening. So Drum Magazine kind of represents this like aspirational moment in the city and in the township, right? I mean, really, truly, these images could very well be like the scenes that were happening in Harlem, but also not images that you associate with South Africans, right? And so Drum Magazine kind of represented that diasporic dialogue that the regime was actively trying to suppress. So I wanted you all to kind of have a real important look at that because, Africa's leading magazine. So those are some of the images. And then there's the Sophiatown sound because Hugh Masekela, this is him in 1954, was very much so a part of the kind of making of South African jazz, and also very famous during this time were the Manhattan Brothers featuring Miriam Makeba, this album Kilimanjaro, also this kind of Pan-African approach to music and sound, the Swingsters featuring Dali Ratebe, and then Dali Matebe and Dorothy Masuka. So I wanted you all to kind of hear what this looks like and see if it kind of matches and what comes up for you. Dorothy Masuka, who's actually from Zimbabwe, but moved to South Africa and moved to Sophiatown to kind of develop herself as a singer. What's interesting about this, and I just made this connection as I'm listening to this song that I've heard a million times, but I just heard the connection. I just heard ska. Did you hear ska? Let's play it again. And so these diasporic connections blow my mind because the reason why we hear ska is because this sound is very much so influenced by sort of earliest stages of R&B in the US. So did you hear me? I said the South African sound, which articulates a kind of sonic Jamaican presence through ska, is about what Black Americans were doing, right, at the earliest stages of R&B. Why? Because Jamaicans who were producing that sound were listening to Black American R&B, right, in the early 1950s, not just listening to through their sort of underground pirate station hookups, which they were, and a lot of times listening to radio coming out of New Orleans and Miami, but also that as a part of this kind of migrant worker, connection and exchange, Jamaicans would go to the Black South, right, and work the Florida orange fields and plantations, and as a part of their work, their return with albums, right? So that's really some of the like earliest stages of like how ska comes to form. And this is not to erase some of the like indigenous sounds and traditional sounds of Jamaican, sort of like Minto, for example. Like very much so Jamaicans were producing their own music, but there were no studios, right? There was a massive kind of British presence that was like suppressing these kind of, especially like indigenous sounds that were oftentimes connected to resistance or sort of African influenced traditional sounds and non-Christian ones. So this listening to the radio, and then South Africans listening to Black Americans, and then ska being created and Black Americans listening to ska, right? This like real interesting place that makes origin kind of impossible to find. Like who's influencing who, right? So, but that is interesting that Sophia Town, 1950s, ska, 1950s, R&B in America, 1950s, shows up in that song. Another example.
Dizokwenza nombikanga, dizokwenza nombikanga, dizokwenza nombikanga.
This is Dali
dizokwenza
singing.
nombikanga. Wale lomtan, tachengo meva, aingo me, itolofi. Wale lomtan, tachengo meva, aingo me, itolofi. Anika tali no bogute, Isono sani sing oli. Anika tali no bogute, Isono sani sing oli. Wale lomtan, wale lomtan, wale lomtan, itolofi. Wale lomtan, wale lomtan, wale lomtan, itolofi.
What instruments do you all hear? Weren't prepared for that question. Let me play it again. What'd you say? Clarinet. Certainly the clarinet, absolutely. What else? Mm-hmm.
Like jazz drum.
Yep. But you called it by the style that the drum was being played. Yep. Okay. Is this what comes to mind when you think of South Africa?
But then you also, I mean, that's an interesting thing that it's like you can hear the crossover sort of.
Absolutely.
Diasporic.
Pollination. You can hear. What do you hear in that? Who do you hear?
Billie Holiday.
Billy. Interesting.
Do you want?
What'd you say?
Like, do you want?
Yes, I hear a yes, absolutely, faintly, but I know where you're coming because it's going in that direction. But it's interesting for me because yes, first of all, the answer is yes to all of our answers, right? Because it's that like cross-pollination sound. But I actually hear, and again, this is surprising because I didn't hear it before. I hear Hollywood.
That was the feeling.
Yeah. And I hear Hollywood's sort of adaptation of black sound. I didn't know I felt that way. Say it again.
I was going to say Cole Porter.
Say it again. Oh, Cole Porter. In that family, right? But then, so that's interesting to think about Billie Holiday. The only reason why I didn't think about Dilly Holiday, interesting. About Billie, that sounds, no, never mind. So the only reason why I didn't think about Billie Holiday is because of pace, and it's upbeat. Like, she usually doesn't go in terms of tempo. Like, she stays usually and typically at a pace, but yeah, that's interesting to hear what you all heard. So, the Manhattan Brothers. Again, this is all Sophia Town music. Raise your hand if you heard The Lion Sleeps Tonight. Okay, so let me let you hear it again. That's complex. That is complex. That choral, that harmonize, that lead, and that is Miriam Makeba with the Manhattan Brothers. That is, her first kind of band before she goes to the U.S. And so that's interesting. That lion, that. Did you all hear that? sort of an echo of that, which is interesting because that song itself, I can't remember the black composer, but I know that their family is currently in a legal battle because obviously that song has become attached to the Lion King, right? It has been absolutely not just separated from this kind of South African context, but once again, it is a highly lucrative, right, song in the world in terms of how it resonates and what it's associated with, and for that matter, who doesn't benefit from it financially.
Hapo zamani mama siku ya hivi mama. Hapo zamani mama siku ya hivi mama. Sasa hapo zamani mama shauri ya pombe mama. Sasa hapo zamani mama shauri ya pombe mama. Siku ya hivi mama. Siku ya hivi mama.
What do you hear? Oh, interesting. Absolutely, I can say that, a kind of wailing. What about production? As in studio quality?
Yeah, the acoustic guitar was very lush,
Very present, right?
present, very clean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's but in listening to that, what sound system geographies will ask you to do is to investigate the studio, and then to ask questions about why the
Production.
precisely, right? And then is that where you find out the truth, which is that so many of these particular albums, which by the way, that was Mary McCabe when she went solo. And
What
if
year was that?
oh, good question. 1964.
Well, that must have been like big, like Universal, like Warner.
Precisely, but okay, so we're getting ahead of ourselves, right? So that's perfect. It's the kind of ahead I like to get in front of. But so I want to talk about this, right? So I kind of jumped ahead because I got excited, but I want to really have us come back and think about what I said, which was that the place where, right, the geographic location, the space, the township where these amazing songs and sounds were being created or listened to or recreated or re-articulated or reinterpreted, right, was destroyed. People were dislocated, right? And alongside with that is the destruction of their things, of their albums, of their story, of their books, of their clothes, of their albums, of their, right, like traces of who they are. Those things were very much so part of what was dislocated and sort of scattered. And so that is a major distinction between like a Sophia town and Harlem. So unlike Harlem, outside of Drum Magazine, many of the cultural products created during that time were also destroyed, scattered, or intentionally erased, requiring a kind of practice-based recording of history through song and memory. Another thing to note is that many artists received recording contracts when Sophia town was like sort of at its height. And then alongside the forced removals, there were also restrictions that prevented them from collecting royalties. And then apartheid's reach, forcing many of those musicians into employment in the mines, as in the diamond mines, as in the gold, right? Or other industries that exploited Black labor. It was also under these conditions that many South African musicians, including Hugh and Medium, began to live in exile between the US and Europe. And in fact, Hugh moved to the US and received his first trumpet from Louis Armstrong through an anti-apartheid activist by the name of Father Trevor Huddleston. So that's a very interesting kind of development, is that part of what we're hearing in that production and the quality of it is that she left South Africa, right? And she goes to the US. And interestingly enough, she connects with Harry Belafonte, who I just remembered that he also sings The Lion Sleeps Tonight. That's crazy. So these things come to me. And so, they partnered for at least a decade. Interestingly enough, this is all coming to me. And now she ends up being, in addition to kind of banished and banned from South Africa and living in exile in the U.S., although she was very much so welcomed throughout the continent of Africa and also throughout Europe, what's interesting is that they had been creating together. Harry Belafonte is kind of responsible for introducing her, kind of like how, Biggie introduced Lil' Kim. No, it's not that. But it is in that family of like men having access and introducing, women. But so he introduced, Miriam Makeba to Black America, which was interesting because even I remember growing up hearing the Click song, which I will play. But they worked together for multiple years, certainly at least a decade. But then they had a really interesting political falling out. Why? Because Miriam Makeba spoke out against apartheid and Zionism in Israel. And she was literally blacklisted from Black folks as well, who were concerned about how they would, be penalized, be punished, be attacked, be ostracized, be blacklisted for speaking out against Israel. 1960s, right? I think that's a very important part of history because that connection, when we think about South Africa taking the case against Israel to, the ICJ in The Hague in the Netherlands, it is interesting that it was Miriam Makeba, a South African woman who experienced apartheid, who was trying to speak out against Israel in the U.S. in the 1960s and was absolutely treated the way that folks are being treated today. Punished, silenced, right? Imprisoned, kidnapped. So I think that that's just like an interesting part of that history. So I will share with you what she is most famous for in the U.S. because I remember hearing this song as a kid and just being intrigued and confused.
In my native village in Johannesburg, there is a song that we always sing when a young girl gets married. It's called the Click Song by the English because they cannot say Ongotwane.
I cannot either.
Igqirha lendlela nguNgotwane. Igqirha lendlela kuthiwa nguNgotwane. Igqirha lendlela haya nguNgotwane. Igqirha lendlela kuthiwa nguNgotwane. Haya selaqala ligqithapho haya nguNgotwane. Selequbule ligqithapho nguNgotwane. Selaqala ligqithapho haya nguNgotwane. Selequbule ligqithapho nguNgotwane.
And still, ooh, which is interesting, right? Because then that becomes a kind of stereotypical South African sound in the U.S., right? And then you have a lot of Hollywood films that are using that sound, this ethnic, not even necessarily South African, but this ethnic sound, right? That to me also sounds like Hollywood. But what is not Hollywood is her Osa, right? and that the song in itself refuses to be, appropriated. There's a part of it that is protected, and she introduces it as such. The English cannot pronounce this song. And I live in Johannesburg, and I hear these clicks all day, and I'm like, these are a deep people because these clicks are consistent with the different forms of music. Like, I'm like, you have a people who have a kind of beatbox technology built into the language. I mean, it's like I'll just say right, which we're going to talk about, which is a subgenre of electronic music, right? I mean, it took me years to learn. I was like I have to right, and then you start to think about, the role of the mouth and the tongue and the teeth and sound and song and what makes people distinct and what it means to listen to place. and what it means to lose language. So that's the click song. I think I'm gonna do, I wasn't gonna do, so we're in the 1960s now, and I definitely have a very deep relationship with South African jazz, and I'm thinking about a very important thing about the question of exile in South African musicians. Miriam Makeba, Hugh Masekela, Busi Mhlongo, right, is a person who was from Durban, a Zulu woman who was from Durban, who moved to Amsterdam, and who lived between Amsterdam and London, and who worked with West African musicians from Paris to kind of create music in Amsterdam and in London. And what is really interesting is the tension between those who left and those who stayed behind, and what South African means, what South African music means in an exile context, right? So the tension, right? Those musicians who were at home, who quite honestly, many of them were not happy about the fact that they could not leave. And really, this is the story of like migration globally, the question of who stays behind, who gets to leave. It's gendered. Oftentimes, folks who were exiled were men. And so that tension is interesting because in South Africa, while Hugh and Miriam Makeba were in New York, to be exact, some powerful form of jazz was developing, especially in Cape Town, which is referred to as Cape Jazz. I'm not going to go deeply into this because this is like, quite honestly, in the sketching part of my work. I really want to go deep into South African jazz. But my work is sort of at war with my desire to tell the story of electronic music and my real deep desire to sit deeply in these kind of like South African, Black American jazz solidarity practices. But what I will do is introduce you to one of the most important Cape jazz musicians. Originally, his name was Dollar Brand. Is anyone familiar with Dollar Brand? So yeah, he was a Cape Townian, and he actually converted to Islam and became Abdullah Ibrahim. And this is a song in Kosi, which means thank you in Xhosa. So, Dollar Brand. He's a pianist. What do you hear? Okay. So I think, first of all, he's still alive, and he's on tour, and he's in his 90s. Yeah, and so, I mean, truly, he is a South African sort of beloved artist. So we are going to kind of move through and quickly out of the jazz South African sort of moment, because I want to sit with that, but I wanted you to at least know that, folks like Abdullah Ibrahim were in conversation, because if we're talking about the 1960s and we are talking about like Impulse Records, John Coltrane, this kind of like free jazz moment, this hard bop or post bop moment. And, Abdullah Ibrahim has dedicated songs to like Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk. Like there was a real conversation happening underneath, again, the sort of radar of the apartheid regime. But those jazz practices are a really important sort of fertile ground for us to explore the political condition of Black folks globally at that time, because we're talking about the anti-colonial movements that are happening in the 1960s. We're also talking about the fact that Malcolm X was killed in 1965. Clearly, many people in South Africa who were organizing, obviously from the ANC and other sort of militant organizations, were organizing and kind of, and mobilizing folks against the apartheid regime. But jazz, right, becomes this voice and becomes this diasporic voice of resistance, and it's instrumental. And so that's why it's interesting, right, that there were these strategies of actual violence against the music, censoring what might be heard. This is really interesting. I wasn't even going to bring this up, but it makes me think about my chapter on London, because there is like a kind of physical violence against speakers and drums, right? Like literally when I think about the blues dance parties that were happening in London in the 1960s and the 70s, very specifically because immigrants were trying to find places to be and oftentimes had to occupy businesses vacant buildings and kind of create their own parties and sound systems. And that when they were busted, that the cops would oftentimes come in with sharp objects and destroy the speakers. And so when I found out that there was this whole campaign, and actually I want to read from my notes because I don't want to take a tangent. So one of the regime's primary concerns, or rather, between the 1960s and the 1990s, a broad campaign of censorship targeted music across South Africa. One of the regime's primary concerns was the circulation of music and, by extension, ideas between South Africa and neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique. The state feared that music could move more freely than borders allowed, carrying messages of solidarity and resistance. Even more threatening to the apartheid regime was the flow of anti-apartheid thought and sound coming from Black America. The rhythms, lyrics, and imagery of soul, funk, and jazz reached South African audiences through records, cassettes, and radio, offering a different vocabulary of freedom. Censorship was carried out through state institutions such as the South African Broadcasting Corporation, which sought to control what could be heard and what could be played and what possibilities could circulate through sound. You know what? I actually own one of these albums. It was given to me as a gift. And there is one song that is crossed out. They would use very sharp objects. They would listen to the albums, first of all, to see if there were references, oftentimes not being able to speak the language, and sort of cross out things based on what they could understand through the title. If things referenced some kind of political struggle, but, which I find to be very interesting, one of the things that caused the most alarm were like songs that had titles with the word land in it. So when you think about this recent thing that Trump did of inviting white South Africans, I just want to bring us into this kind of history of the present and I talked about this kind of 1934 Land Act that made it impossible for Black South Africans to buy land. Right? And I live there. I am witnessing every day the legacies of apartheid, every single day. And so just any kind of reference to land, but also references that sort of moved away from or hinted at African traditional or South African traditional spiritual practices, in other words, things that were non-Christian, any kind of like hinting towards miscegenation and sort of racial mixing, right? Obviously political messages, but albums were destroyed. They were listened to. There was a team of folks, this was their department in the South African Broadcasting Corporation headquarters, where they would listen to these albums, organize them accordingly, and decide on what songs would be censored. And then those albums would be returned to the townships and allowed to sort of circulate and be distributed through local record stores. So you would buy these albums and they were pre-listened to. So this is just an example of some of those songs. It's interesting. Restricted Upon a Painted Ocean. Bob Dylan was restricted. Tom Jones passed. That's interesting. I'm revealing my age. No worries. So Yeah. So I think that that's just like a real important part of the research, is thinking about sort of like white violence against Black music, even in physical form, and what that looked like and how those practices continue today in different forms, just the regulation of sound. Yeah, and so I just wanted to just have you all check that out. So we're going to move into the 1970s and the early formation of the decade of resistance. One of the most significant moments of this period was the 1976 Soweto uprisings, which is a response to the forced Bantu education system imposed on South African youth, along with the state's requirement that they learn and speak in Afrikaans. It's also very interesting for me to live between Amsterdam and Johannesburg. I'm in a crazy world, right? Where I hear Afrikaans being spoken in Johannesburg, but then I can recognize Afrikaans, which is not Afrikaans, but Dutch in Amsterdam. Also, I am very, very safe in Amsterdam. I can go anywhere, any time of the day. I can go leave my home at 3 a.m. on a bike with my computer, with my things, and not have to worry. I can honestly say I have lived there for certainly 5 years. I've been living there on and off for a decade. I don't ever remember feeling fear. As a woman, as a Black woman in a white country, I've not experienced fear in Amsterdam. In South Africa, I will not leave my house after the sun sets. And I really need us to understand that it requires Dutch safety for that to be happening. Like the literal extraction of resources, the continued exploitation of Black labor, the legacies of apartheid exist so that people are literally consuming, robbing, raping, killing, stabbing each other because of limited resources, right? And I have a high quality of life in Amsterdam. But I also have a super high quality of life in Johannesburg in terms of culture, in terms of literature, in terms of music, in terms of cinema. I have never been to a more inspiring city. South Africans are like the ones in my life that I am in community with are like super sharp and super talented, so much so that the industries can't even hold the talent. I mean, it is, and so there's a crisis with employment. Right? Not just because of a lack of resources per se, of course that's it, but because of the hyper presence of talent. It's actually deeply interesting to watch. So living between South Africa and the Netherlands is a real kind of, it requires discipline for me to, yes, know that I have to kind of be smart about how I move in Johannesburg, but I have to also make sure to not think that South Africans are inherently violent, or that the Dutch are inherently peaceful. You see, there's a balance. So, the energy from that uprising didn't just stay in the streets, it made its way into sound. You can hear it in the music that followed the 1976 Soweto uprisings and the rhythms that carried both anger and possibility. I still hear that. Even when the music seemed light, it was coming from a generation trying to find language, movement, and release under the weight of surveillance and control.
Right, Max?
Sibuyile, njenganyakanye, sithi umculo kawupheli. Sibuyile, njenganyakanye, sithi umculo kawupheli. Sizana ukhona, nanamhla usekhona. Sizana ukhona, nanamhla usekhona.
In fatigue,
Sizana ukhona,
army fatigue.
nanamhla usekhona umculo. Sizana ukhona, nanamhla usekhona. Sizana ukhona, nanamhla usekhona. Sizana ukhona, nanamhla usekhona umculo. Umculo, injabulo, engapheli. Umculo, uhambisa umsebenzi.
So I think that's super important, that sort of the kind of rumblings of the decade of resistance, which happens in the 1980s, which is like one of the most fierce forms of like organized, protest in South Africa that resulted in a lot of, South Africans who were murdered. But this, this June 16th, 1976 Soweto uprising was super, super intense because it was children. There were teenagers who were murdered, right? And do you hear that song that's happening at the same time where it's difficult to kind of pin down how they are being brutalized? The song, the music still sounds hopeful. And so, I think that that's just a very important way for us to begin to enter the kind of question around South African house music, which has quite honestly taken the world by storm, right? Like it is, I'm not sure if that's a part of your world, but South African house, certainly diasporically, occupies a very new space that typically is reserved for two sort of groups in the Black diaspora, and that's Black Americans and Jamaicans, where you're going to find like reggae. I have heard reggae and found reggae and jazz and soul and funk and rap wherever I am in the world. But now I'm starting to hear South African music, obviously like Amapiano being one of the larger sounds that's like dominating the music scene, certainly DJ culture, festival culture. So I, every year I'm invited to do like a talk or a lecture on the history of house music at Amsterdam dance event, which is called ADE. So I'll be there next week talking about, women vocalists that have been sort of marginalized and not really considered as part of the kind of creative force around the sonic structure of house music. But there are many, many events featuring kind of discussions about South African house music. And so I'm just trying to build a story for you all visually and sonically to understand like the history of this music sounding as if, or not sort of, not wearing the stain of violence on the sound. It's just because again, living there and witnessing the intense poverty, and then going to a party in the township and being unable to move. The thing is, when I say I'm 50, I don't go out anymore, anywhere else in the world unless I'm paid to. If you want to pay me to DJ, sure. But otherwise, I'm at home by 10. But when I am in South Africa, I cannot help but to go to these. First of all, the live jazz scene is out of this world, but then the parties, I don't know how it's possible, especially because I get extremely bored because I spend my life listening to music. Oftentimes I'm not surprised, I'm not impressed. DJs are playing the same songs, or they're going for like the familiar, right? Like, so I'm usually underwhelmed. But when I go to these parties, I remember in December of last year going to a party in Soweto. And I got there at 10 because it was like 10 until. So I was like, okay, I know how I roll. I'm going to be in bed by 1. So I got there at 10, again, past my bedtime, and I was like, okay. Every single song until I left at 4 a.m. 4 a.m. Every song. I was to the point where I just like stayed to prove that I was gonna be wrong. Like, you make me wrong, please. Every song from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. They were still partying when I left. My friends called me at 6 and said, hey, we're leaving now. Every song. And then they have a dance for every song, right? Like, so me, I'm just sitting in the corner. I am a student. I am a witness. Right? Like, and I just can't even believe it. I can't believe it because, again, what I witness on the daily, South Africa has the highest number of rapes in the world. The highest sort of, just gender-based violence there is really, really something that is just like horrifying. So many things, right? This question of danger, but also legacies of apartheid. So we're building up now to this kind of moment where I wanted you all to see, you heard that sound, but then I want you to kind of see where it's coming from. I know that we're running out of time soon, huh?
Yeah, sadly.
Well, let's see. Oh, well, perhaps this one doesn't want to. Okay.
Soweto,
under fire. The country's largest township had a dark cloud hovering over it. June 16, 1976, presented a new form of resistance towards the Afrikaans language policy introduced under the Bantu education in 1953 under the then apartheid government. It was under Bantu education that the then apartheid government spent 644 rands on a white child's education as opposed to a mere 42 rands on a black child's education. It was such inequalities, coupled with the Afrikaans language being enforced on black students, that led to a revolt. On that fateful day of June the 16th, what was supposed to be a peaceful protest by black students against the Afrikaans language policy turned ugly. Police fired at thousands of protesting students, killing 176 of them and leaving thousands injured. It was such inequalities fought by the youth and political movements that paved the way to a new political dawn in South Africa.
Right? So the sound, yeah, I'm very curious about the sound, right? So, bubblegum music and synth music that follows this sound, and the decade of resistance. And by the way, that kind of phrasing of that decade was informed by the work of Steve Biko and many others who he was like in conversation with, mobilizing with, but also reading diasporically, reading about anti-colonial struggles, reading about kind of black nationalism, the civil rights movement, reading about just other sort of, resistance movements in diaspora, and bringing some of those conversations to South Africa at a time where there was a kind of similar tension, say, for example, between the strategies of like the ANC and those who were kind of forming, these like resistance groups that were refusing to be nonviolent, much like what was happening in the US in the 1960s with this kind of Malcolm Martin binary, Martin being nonviolent, Malcolm X being willing to protect himself by any means necessary. So those same kinds of tensions about strategy and approach existed there based on context, and it was localized. But again, still, this is the sound of when the synthesizer is introduced in the early 80s. So the Mahotela Queens, and again, more tension, the tension between tradition and technology. So you have the cows by the Casio synth machine. I mean, it's just like this. This is an interesting thing visually, but also sonically, because I think one of the other reasons why I decided to live in Johannesburg too is like something that I witnessed that helped me recover from the DJ depression I have been struggling with, which is this kind of deep distance between just like music that comes before, like in a deep like engagement of like where sound comes from, different genres, thinking about place, like all of these things that I feel like once you get streaming platforms involved, right, that part of what it takes to be successful is to quite honestly, make it really difficult for people to concentrate and focus and stay present in, their curiosities about a sound and spend time with it. And again, personal experience. But one of the reasons why I was like, I really think I can live here. This was in 2023. I was just visiting for like 4 months and trying to figure out where I could go, knowing that Trump was emerging again, just what was happening there. I was like, I think I need a new place. I knew that I was leaving, the U.S. permanently, but I needed another place besides Amsterdam and besides London. And so going there and witnessing what happens when, say, for example, you play a song like that, which came out in like 1983, and everyone in the room knows the song, generation after generation. I have not seen that. There's certain people, we know Michael Jackson songs, we know certain Prince songs, there's certain songs, but in South Africa, I don't care, like, they break into song across generations in ways that I don't even, because there's a history of having to preserve the music, on the body, through the memory, passing it on. It's on the radio, right? That you're going to turn on the radio and you're going to hear music regularly played from the 1980s and from now. So people are constantly keeping the culture alive. And what's really interesting is that it's super difficult to get these albums on vinyl. A real interesting fact that it's nearly impossible to, how many of you are familiar with a Mapiano? So we'll listen to some of it as we wrap up. But like, it is nearly impossible to find a Mapiano, and also which is from Durban, like on vinyl. Like, and it's really deep to think about even the age at which people are creating music. We'll get into that later. I wanted to also introduce you all to someone who plays like she's a major figure in my research, and mainly because of how her story parallels Whitney Houston's. And her name is Brenda Fassie. And she is very much so kind of like, I hate to use these gender terms, but referred to as like the mother of bubblegum and synth music. But she was very much so like a badass, and she was like, yes, I'm queer, and yes, I do drugs, and right in the face of this kind of, this tension between tradition and like, and the kind of, these sort of modern ideas around like sexuality that are non-Christian, right? So you're dealing with not just the legacies of apartheid, but also the legacies of missionary work in South Africa. And here Brenda Fassie comes to enter the chat with her like full-on sexual liberation, but also ushering in a new sound. And so she has, she's from Cape Town. She was from Cape Town. She died in the late 90s from a drug overdose. And she is just kind of considered to be just like this, like, careless, carefree person who was able to even charm Mandela. But she produced a song called Black President before Mandela was released, and just became just like, just like a primary, just like place of pride for many South Africans. But again, who's associated with the, quite honestly, like the sort of intersection between house music, bubblegum music, synth music, and kwaito music. And we'll just play a little of all of those, but I wanted you to meet her and the Dudes. That's the name of her band. Brenda and the Big Dudes. These keyboards.
Get yourself somebody to sing with you. Stop, go, stand up, and don't be shy. Everybody's dancing, now don't be late. Sing along, toss and turn, don't be late. The feel is so good.
Mid-80s. I can't turn it up.
The feel is so nice. We are feeling so good.
Oh, hey.
We are feeling so good. It's nice to be with people. With my friends, we're moving on the dance.
Right? So like African disco synth pop. Again, think about what's happening outside the studio doors. Like, and so this is another super important synth artist by the name of Professor 3. And when I play this, you will hear the early sort of the like roots of like South Africa moving towards house music. 1985. I mean, so when I first went to South Africa in 2001, I kept hearing this sound. I was in Durban. I was at the World Conference Against Racism, and I just kept seeing these taxis, and I kept hearing this sound, and I was just like, what is this, right? And local folks were like, yeah, this is Kwaito. And I'm like, but this is giving me like some kind of house, but it's not as fast as house. But then it's also kind of these hip hop lyrics, but it was called Kwaito, right? And so I kind of jumped ahead because I know that we don't have time. But basically we go from like, that sound in 1985, where even in thinking about beats per minute, that is still below 120 that we just heard, right? But then like Kwaito was even slower. It was just like about like 80 to 90 beats per minute, right? And so it's really interesting and significant because this is the sound of those who were quote unquote born free, right? Nelson Mandela was released in I'm doing this because apartheid still exists and his legacies are still alive, right? And there is a real conversation around Nelson Mandela's role in the kind of exchange of power and who still maintains power in South Africa. So it's an interesting conversation, not to mention that his wife, Winnie Mandela, was super radical. And in fact, they divorced, and that became a whole kind of interesting public debate around policy. Because again, Nelson Mandela was talking about, Rainbow Nation, which let's share the wealth. Although, we're starting, on unequal footing, but still like, let's share the wealth. And Winnie Mandela's policy and politics were like, we don't compromise. Like, this is our land, right? So I'm simplifying that. There's nuance there. I'm just, again, like I'm thinking about the movement between like 1985 and 1995. Mandela's released in 91. Apartheid is abolished and dismantled in 1994. And during that year, between 1994 and 1997, is the birth and the formation of Kwaito music. And this is Kwaito. Technology is changing. Studios are better. There are more studios in Johannesburg, in Cape Town. Kwaito. This is traditional, like early Kwaito. This is what I was hearing in Durban in 2001. So I think what's really interesting about South Africa is, say, when you take into consideration, I'm going to go dark here, corrective rape, and the presence of HIV/AIDS in the townships, is that, again, I talked about gender-based violence and the fact that, rape and violence against women is horrific in that country, and also violence against queer people, right? What is fascinating to me is that if we are talking about house music, we are talking about queer music, right? And so when I say that in South Africa, if I am in an elevator, at a grocery store, at the doctor's office, in an Uber, on the train, wherever I am, I hear house music. It is music that Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela were dancing to. House music is the national sound and has been for the last 30 years. National sound. And so then it becomes interesting to think about different subgenres of house music. As I talked about, Brenda Fassie was from Cape Town, but then she moved to Joburg, which is where more of the studios were. But when I was, I started to go back and forth to South Africa. I went back in 2013, and I was in a network with DJs. We had our USBs. We were trading music. And I was just like, how the hell did house music land in South Africa, especially when you think about the censorship and the fact that house music wasn't being widely distributed in the 80s. So you're literally talking about people who were traveling, usually white South Africans, to the US and to Europe, and returning with trips, right? And bringing back this music that was highly censored in the townships. And what I found to be super interesting is that I was asking them about why house music. Hold on one second. And they were like, because it was gangster. And I was like, well, this is deep. When I think about how the queer folks that I understand to be thinking through sound and making house music, I wouldn't identify them as being gangster. So even that language is interesting, to associate that sound with what is gangster. The other sound, or the other word and phrase that they used to describe house music, was international music, right? But the song that I heard consistently from DJs saying it was this song that changed it for us, in Durban, in Pretoria, in Cape Town, in Johannesburg, in Limpopo, right? It was Frankie Knuckles, who was from New York, moved to Chicago, and is considered to be this gender language, father of house music, but is considered to be sort of one of the thought leaders around house music. And it was this song that they said was playing everywhere for years. It's Frankie Knuckles' The Whistle Song. Frankie Knuckles is from New York, as I said, started off as a DJ in the Continental Bathhouses in New York alongside Larry Levan, who went on to be the DJ/conductor at the Paradise Garage in New York. He moved to Chicago, started a party called The Warehouse. In 1981 is when he had one of the first parties at The Warehouse. And the way that they describe the way that the word house music comes to form is that Frankie Knuckles would be playing at The Warehouse with a massive sound system. And people would try to find the music that they heard there. It wasn't house music, because we're talking about 1981, pre-house. It was the disco, the sort of post-boogie, gospel, dance floor gospel that was being played in New York and then had migrated to Chicago. And people would, because that's gorgeous. And so people would, drive around town, go into record stores, looking for songs that he played. And so my understanding is the record store owners would would shorten the word and be like, house music can be found here, which is where you can go and pick up, those songs that were played at this party. I think what's also interesting about this time, 1981, and when it ended up in the townships after 85, is that house music as a term is born the same exact year that the first 3 AIDS cases were discovered in the US. House music is literally experiencing this kind of parallel history with the HIV/AIDS crisis. 1981 is when house music becomes a form of a genre. And 1981 is when people are introduced to this virus. And that virus then becomes a part of a really tragic, ongoing, disappearing dance floor, right? So that's an example. And I think I'm just gonna literally play a little, because I know we have to go, and now I don't even think there's time for questions. but I think it's important that at the very least you hear like how house music has evolved in South Africa. I'm really gonna skip around and I'm just gonna go straight into what I feel like made it possible for me to survive the pandemic while I was writing this book. Sadly, it was Spotify, as I'm working on removing myself from that platform. I am sad about the fact that I discovered this new genre. Nope, I'm gonna start with Gom. So I was in Durban, which has a high concentration of Zulus in South Africa. And again, just like in 2001, when I kept hearing this sound, I kept hearing this really intense sound, again, coming out of the taxis that were taking people in and out of the townships to return home, out of the townships to work as domestic workers, right? And other really interesting, I think compromising positions, not that their dignities were on the line, but that it's just an extension of this extremely unequal society. But I kept hearing this sound and I was like, what am I hearing? And it was this. The bass, yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, that's already funky. I mean, if you are a house, I don't know, are there house heads in the place? Yay, one of us, two of us. Okay, you don't have to be though, but so I think what's interesting about that, first of all, just knowing this kind of Zulu history and how in South Africa there's this real interesting, again, tension between like Zulu folks, Xhosa folks, Swana folks from Lesotho, from Limpopo, Pedi folks, like that Zulus occupy, even in the collective imagination globally, of like what we think of when we think of Shaka Zulu, right? Is this person who was able to like ward off the British, who fought the British supposedly single-handedly or with his army and all of these things. And then you listen to this sound and it has this like warrior energy attached. Also, I think what's interesting about South African electronic music coming out of this apartheid context and having these kind of cultural, subcultural undertones is that it sounds like it can be the same. Those rhythms, of course, that's like, one of the characteristics of certain electronic, or just electronic music in general, or so-called EDM. But it manages to have, yes, that kind of sonic, structure, but I hear it differently. Yeah, I already heard the shift in how the second song comes in. So yeah, I was like, okay, that's amazing. That's great music. I hear it. But then to go back to that story and we can end here is that I was like, it's about my kind of love, my deep love relationship with Amapiano. And what happened was like, algorithms. I just randomly saw something. I pushed play and I was like, I know for sure as a person who's been listening to music for like consciously for like 40 years, I rarely get this feeling. When I heard the music, I was like, okay, what are South Africans doing? Like, what has happened here? Something has shifted. And right after that, we went into the pandemic. Something really important to think about South African music is a lot of what you hear, which is another reason why I do need to move away from Spotify, is that a lot of these songs are produced by people who are under 21, right? Like, these are kids that are like moving my soul, right? But also who have access to like secondhand equipment, right? But then they go into the pandemic, right? And into so-called lockdown. And the proliferation, new songs, new albums were coming out while I was sitting on my couch. Like literally, there will be groups that would be like releasing new albums with like 20 songs like every 3 months, right? Like, there is no way, right? So Amapiano, I think what's really important about Amapiano too is what I saw it do diasporically to Black people, and I do believe that it was about the healing frequencies and bass and how we have historically responded to it globally. Amapiano has such an unruly bass. It drops below any register of bass I have heard in house music. It is unruly. Speakers don't know how to hold it. So therefore, South Africans build pristine, serious sound systems to be able to hold it. So when I was there in December from 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., it was because the sounds crisp, just like crystal clear, like unkind bass, right? That I loved. And so this is Amapiano. Because the bass goes down one more time. The bass drops to turn off. And that's how I ended up at that party till 4 a.m. Like, I couldn't move. And then so the last thing that I will say, so we have these histories, right? Like, of these people not being able to buy land where they lived for generations. And still, like, literally, less than 15% of Black South Africans own land. Many people are still in the mines. Women are absolutely vulnerable. Like, crime is crazy. And these sounds are coming out of the townships, right? And that lower register of bass, when we left the pandemic, all I saw in London, in Paris, in Amsterdam, in LA, in New York, there were Amapiano parties. And in these white spaces, like Paris or these majority white countries in Europe, like, you would go to Amapiano parties. I have not seen Black people gather like that around a sound, really, actually, quite honestly, in my life, outside of like hip hop, right? Or even, like, again, reggae. But what that bass has done, and really following the pandemic at that, it was like, and then the music is intricate, right? And so I just think that it's important to be able to listen to place and understand the kind of political and geographical context under which the music emerges, and not understand it solely for your, like, entertainment, purposes, but to understand that, like, it has a history that you can benefit from being curious about, just being curious about. And so, yes, Thank you for coming to Sound System Geographies.